The sun beat down on the dusty town square that afternoon and Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat pulled low over his weathered face. He had driven his cattle to market that morning like he did every month and planned to head back to his ranch before nightfall. The town was busier than usual and people gathered near the platform in the center of the square where auctions were held. Thomas had lived alone on his ranch for 15 years now. His days followed the same quiet rhythm of tending cattle and mending fences and watching the seasons change across the prairie. He was 58 years old and his face carried the lines of a man who had known both joy and sorrow. His wife Margaret had passed when he was 43 and since then the ranch house had felt too large and too silent. He was about to turn away and head to the general store when he heard the auctioneer's voice rise above the crowd. Thomas paused and something made him stay. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable shift in the crowd's mood or perhaps it was simply meant to be. Next item up for bidding, the auctioneer called out and Thomas felt his stomach turn when he saw what was happening. A young woman stood on the platform and her clothes were worn and dirty and her face was marked with bruises. Her hands were bound and she kept her eyes down while a rough-looking man shoved her forward. "Found her wandering near my property," the man announced loudly. "No papers and no family. She's strong enough for field work or whatever else you might need." The crowd murmured and Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't how people should be treated. He had seen many things in his years but this kind of cruelty still made his blood boil. The bidding started and Thomas watched in disgust as men called out prices like she was a piece of livestock. The young woman stood perfectly still and her face showed no emotion but Thomas could see the slight trembling in her shoulders. She looked to be in her early 30s and despite the dirt and bruises there was something dignified in the way she held herself. Without thinking it through Thomas raised his hand and called out a number that silenced the crowd. It was more money than most of them had seen in months. The auctioneer's eyes widened and he pointed at Thomas. "Sold to the gentleman in the back," he shouted and just like that it was done. Thomas pushed through the crowd and paid the money and felt sick doing it. The man who had brought her took the cash and disappeared quickly. Thomas approached the platform and the young woman finally looked up at him. Her eyes were green and filled with wariness and something else he couldn't quite name. "Come on down from there," Thomas said quietly and held out his hand to help her down the steps. She hesitated and then took it and her hand was small and rough with calluses. He led her away from the crowd and toward his wagon and people stared but Thomas ignored them. When they reached the wagon he pulled out his knife and she flinched. "Easy now," he said gently. "Just cutting those ropes off your hands. Nobody should be tied up like an animal." He cut through the bindings and she rubbed her wrists and watched him carefully. Thomas pulled out a canteen and offered it to her. "You look like you could use some water." She took it and drank deeply and then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said and her voice was hoarse. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Sarah," she replied after a moment. "I'm Thomas," he said. "I have a ranch about 2 hours from here. You're welcome to come with me and rest up. Get some proper food in you. After that you can decide what you want to do. You're free to go wherever you please. I'm not keeping you prisoner." Sarah stared at him like she was trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Why did you spend all that money on me?" Thomas looked out at the horizon and thought about how to answer. "Because it was wrong," he finally said. "What they were doing to you was wrong and I couldn't just stand by and watch it happen. I've got more money than I need anyway. Ranch does well enough." They rode in silence for a while and the wagon creaked along the dusty road. Thomas didn't push her to talk and Sarah seemed grateful for that. She watched the landscape roll by and slowly some of the tension left her shoulders. "How long since you ate?" Thomas asked after about an hour. 2 days, Sarah admitted. Thomas reached behind the seat and pulled out a cloth bundle. "My neighbor Alice always sends me off with more food than one person needs. Here, there's bread and cheese and some dried meat." Sarah took the food and ate slowly at first and then more quickly. Thomas pretended not to notice how hungry she was and kept his eyes on the road. When they reached the ranch the sun was getting low and the house cast long shadows across the yard. Thomas helped Sarah down from the wagon and led her inside. The house was clean but sparse and it had the feeling of a place where only one person lived. "There's a bedroom upstairs on the left," Thomas said. "It's got a proper bed and clean sheets. There's a wash basin and I'll heat some water so you can clean up." I'll make us some supper and you can come down when you're ready. Sarah looked around the house and then back at Thomas. I don't understand, she said. What do you want from me? Thomas met her eyes steadily. Nothing, he said. I want nothing from you except maybe some conversation over supper if you're up for it. You've been through something terrible and you need a safe place to rest. That's all this is. He could see her trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally she nodded and went upstairs. Thomas heard the bedroom door close and he let out a long breath. He hadn't really thought this through, but he couldn't regret it. That young woman had needed help and he had been in a position to give it. Over the next few weeks Sarah stayed at the ranch and slowly came back to life. Thomas learned that she had been traveling west with a wagon train but had gotten separated during a storm. The man who found her had kept her locked up and treated her terribly. She didn't want to talk about all of it and Thomas didn't press her. Sarah began helping around the house without being asked. She cooked meals and tended the garden and mended clothes. Thomas protested at first and told her she didn't need to work, but she insisted that it made her feel better to be useful. I'm not good at sitting idle, she explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. My whole life I've worked and it gives me purpose. I can understand that, Thomas said. The ranch keeps me busy and I'm grateful for it. Too much time alone with your thoughts can be a heavy thing. They fell into an easy routine together. Thomas would work the ranch during the day and Sarah would manage the house and the garden. In the evenings they would sit together and talk about simple things. Sarah had a gentle sense of humor that surprised Thomas, and sometimes she would say something that made him laugh in a way he hadn't in years. One day about a month after Sarah arrived, Thomas needed to go back to town for supplies. Sarah asked if she could come along and Thomas agreed. They rode into town together and Thomas noticed how people stared. He didn't think much of it until they were at the general store and Mrs. Henderson made a pointed comment about Thomas having a female companion living with him. Thomas felt his face flush with anger. Sarah is a guest in my home, he said firmly. And she's treated with respect. I'd appreciate if folks kept their gossip to themselves. Mrs. Henderson sniffed disapprovingly but said nothing more. As they left the store, Thomas apologized to Sarah. I'm sorry about that. Small towns can be full of small minds sometimes. It's all right, Sarah said quietly. I'm used to people making assumptions. But Thomas could see that it bothered her and he felt protective in a way that surprised him. Over the past month he had grown fond of Sarah's presence. The house felt warmer with her in it and he looked forward to their evening conversations. He realized with some shock that he was happier than he had been in a very long time. That night as they sat on the porch, Thomas said, Sarah, I've been thinking. The way people talk in town and the assumptions they make. It's not fair to you and I don't want your reputation damaged because of me. Sarah looked at him with concern. Are you asking me to leave? No, Thomas said quickly. Not at all. Actually, I was thinking the opposite. I was thinking that maybe we could make this arrangement more official. I know we haven't known each other long, but I value your company and I think we get along well. What I'm trying to say very badly is, would you consider marrying me? Sarah's eyes widened. Thomas, I don't know what to say. You don't have to answer right now, Thomas said. Think about it. It would be a partnership more than anything. You'd have security and a home and I'd have companionship. I'm not expecting romance or anything like that. I just think we could build a good life together. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Can I ask you something? She finally said. Of course. Why are you so kind? Sarah asked. Most men would have expectations. Most men would demand things. But you've never asked anything of me except my company. Why? Thomas thought about his answer carefully. My Margaret used to say that kindness doesn't cost anything but it's worth everything. When she died I was angry for a long time. Angry at God and angry at the world. But eventually I realized that the best way to honor her memory was to try to be the kind of person she believed I was. Someone who helped others when he could. Someone who treated people with dignity. You deserved kindness, Sarah. You deserved to be treated like a human being and not property. It's as simple as that. Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married the following week in a simple ceremony at the church with just a few witnesses. Sarah wore a dress that Alice had helped her make and Thomas wore his best suit. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Sarah gently on the cheek and she smiled at him with genuine warmth. Life continued much as it had before, except now Sarah wore a wedding ring, and when they went to town she was introduced as Thomas's wife. Most people were pleasant enough, though Thomas could sense some skepticism from certain quarters. About 2 months after the wedding, Thomas and Sarah went to town for the Harvest Festival. It was a big event and people came from all the surrounding ranches and farms. There was music and dancing and plenty of food. Thomas was talking with some of the other ranchers when he saw a commotion near the drink stand. The man who had sold Sarah at the auction had shown up and he was drunk and loud. Thomas felt Sarah tense beside him. Well, the man called out when he spotted them. If it isn't the girl I sold. How much is the old man paying you to warm his bed, sweetheart? The crowd went quiet and Thomas felt rage build in his chest. But before he could move, Sarah stepped forward. I'm his wife, she said clearly. And I'm treated with more respect and kindness than you could ever understand. The man laughed nastily. Wife? Sure. How long until he gets tired of you and sells you to someone else? That's all you're good for. Thomas moved then and placed himself between Sarah and the man. That's enough, he said, and his voice was low and dangerous. You need to leave now. Or what, old man? The drunk sneered. You going to make me? If I have to, Thomas said. But I'd rather you just walk away and leave my wife alone. The man looked at Thomas and seemed to realize that despite his age, Thomas was serious. She's not worth the trouble anyway, he muttered and turned to stumble away. But then he paused and called back, how much you want for her? I'll buy her back and resell her. Probably make a profit. The entire crowd froze and Thomas felt something snap inside him. He turned to face the man fully and his voice rang out clear and strong across the square. She's my wife, Thomas said. She's not for sale. She's not property and she's not a thing to be traded. She's a human being and she's my partner, and if you or anyone else has a problem with that, you can take it up with me. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stood there with his fists clenched and his jaw set, and he met the eyes of everyone watching. He saw Sarah standing beside him with tears streaming down her face, but she was standing tall and proud. The drunk man seemed to shrink under the weight of all those stares. He muttered something and shuffled away quickly. The crowd slowly began to move again and the music started up, but Thomas knew that something had shifted. Over the next few hours, multiple people came up to them to shake Thomas's hand and welcome Sarah properly. Old Mrs. Henderson from the general store even apologized for her earlier coldness. You're a good man, Thomas, she said. And you're lucky to have found each other. On the ride home that night, Sarah was quiet, but when they reached the ranch she turned to Thomas and took his hand. Thank you, she said. For standing up for me. For seeing me as a person. For everything. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. You don't need to thank me for treating you the way everyone deserves to be treated. But not everyone does treat people that way, Sarah said. You're different, Thomas. You're genuinely good. They sat there in the wagon for a moment under the stars. I'm not perfect, Sarah, Thomas said. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. But I try. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better and try to make the world a little kinder. As the months turned into years, Thomas and Sarah built a life together that was richer than either of them had expected. Their partnership deepened into genuine affection and then into love. They learned each other's habits and quirks and found joy in the simple rhythms of ranch life. Sarah's laughter filled the house and Thomas found himself smiling more than he had in decades. They would sit on the porch in the evenings and Sarah would tell stories from her childhood and Thomas would share memories of Margaret. There was no jealousy or competition, just a shared understanding that they had both loved before and that love didn't diminish with time but expanded to make room for more. Years later, when Thomas was 65 and Sarah was 43, they sat on that same porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their ranch had prospered and they had become pillars of the community, known for their generosity and kindness. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked. Spending all that money on me that day? Thomas reached over and took her hand and their fingers intertwined naturally. Not for a single second, he said. That was the best money I ever spent. You gave me back my life, Sarah. You reminded me what it felt like to care about someone and to be cared for in return. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. You saved me, she said softly. In every way a person can be saved. We saved each other, Thomas replied. That's what love does. It saves us from loneliness and despair, and it reminds us that we're not meant to walk through this world alone. They sat together as the stars came out one by one and the night sounds of the prairie surrounded them. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from that chance meeting. A life based on mutual respect and kindness and the simple profound truth that every person deserves dignity. And in the quiet darkness with Sarah's hand warm in his, Thomas thought about that day in the town square when he had stood up and said those words. "She's my wife. She's not for sale." It had been a moment of clarity and conviction, and it had changed everything. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply stand up and say this is wrong and this must stop. Sometimes kindness requires courage and love requires us to be brave. Thomas had learned that lesson late in life, but he had learned it well. The ranch would be passed down eventually to the young couple they had mentored from town. The land would continue to provide and the house would shelter new families. But the real legacy Thomas and Sarah left behind was something intangible yet infinitely more valuable. They showed their community that it was possible to choose compassion over cruelty and dignity over profit and love over loneliness. In the end, that's what mattered most. Not the acres of land or the head of cattle or the money in the bank, but the way they had treated each other and the example they had set. They had taken broken pieces and built something whole. They had turned a moment of horror into a lifetime of happiness. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered across the prairie, it seemed to carry their story with it. A reminder that kindness matters and that one person's courage can change everything, and that love sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways when we're brave enough to reach out and take it.